Hello and welcome to everyone who is joining us for today's episode of the Sprocket Pod. Today we have a really exciting guest, Mr. Ryan Quinn. For those who don't know myself, my name is Cameron Collins. I'm a revenue operations strategist with RevPartners, and I am the community manager of Sprocketeer, the largest independent community for HubSpot admin,
The
director of growth
Van
marketing
White.
with DealHub. That's right, the Vanna White of our Spod podcast. Still a tongue twister after all these episodes. We've got our guest, Ryan Quinn. Ryan, tell everyone a little bit about yourself and what you're currently doing over there at App 8.
Yes, I am a solutions consultant at Aptitude. We just got brought over from an acquisition. I work with clients directly to build solutions on HubSpot.
Huge congratulations to the entire Aptitude 8 team and the workflow team. That was an awesome acquisition to see. I know y'all, I'd heard, we're doing really awesome things over with workflow, and I've been hearing that things have been going well ever since joining forces. So that's really exciting to see. What has anything changed with the way that you've approached your role before and after the acquisition? Have you seen differences in processes, or are you finding that overall it's translated to very much the same thing across organizations?
Yeah, I think as a whole, the work that I'm doing is translated easily. I think internally, there's obviously some processes that change when you go from one company to another. I think overall, not much has changed, but it's been a lot of internal little changes, little tweaks and processes that I've had to learn in working with a new team.
I know that when companies merge or get acquired, from a RevOps perspective, there's challenges, right? Because you have two different systems and you have to incorporate it. Given that both Aptitude 8 and Workflow, that was their job, I wonder, how are you approaching that challenge? How have you approached that challenge internally?
I think a lot of the processes have been built out before we came over. I think that Aptitude does a great job in the processes that they've built out, the client workflow that they've been doing for a long time. I think we came into that perfectly with how we were doing things at workflow. It was an easy transition. A lot of a lot of the day-to-day things changed just in, again, like some of the internal processes, but I think they were doing things at a high level, what we were in ways that we were doing. They have a pre-sales process into a services delivery process. A lot of the overarching processes were the same from workflow to Aptitude date. So I don't think a whole lot changed, but again, some of the internal processes, working with a new team and things like that.
I'll say today's episode is really going to be a love letter to revenue operations professionals and HubSpot super admin that are going to be tuning in. I know we're going to be talking about process mapping, sales enablement, everyone's favorite thing, which is adoption. And then we'll cover revenue operations with some general topics related to it as a whole. But I want to get your thoughts on process mapping because this is something that is really ingrained to all of us strategists here at Rev Partners. I know it's something that's important to you, but I find it really interesting when I might be speaking with someone who's a HubSpot super ad, and as a part of their role, they're really told more just to build things, and they don't really spend a whole lot of time on mapping because they feel like it is taking away from their core objective, which is to build and to do. First and foremost, why is process mapping even important?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think process mapping is important because it's like having a map. If you're lost in a jungle and you don't know where you are, how are you supposed to find your way out? If you have a map, it's easy to have some place to start. So I think process mapping is similar to that because if you haven't defined what your processes are currently, how are you ever supposed to improve those processes? How are you ever supposed to come up with some type of future state to change those processes, right? If you haven't clearly identified the processes that you've got implemented currently. Kind of going into my personal experience, when I first started out in RevOps and HubSpot as a HubSpot admin, I was not the guy who built process maps. I found myself in the dilemma of not having the right context, not being able to reference something like a process map to understand how it is. This is how I need to take this into consideration when I'm building workflows and automation and things like that. So I think process maps give you the right context that you need that you can look back to in the future when you're building things out. It's like you've got your map, you've got your North Star that you can follow at all times. And without a process map, you could be lost without any direction. That's why it's important.
I feel like this is an area where having experience really comes into play because if you are trying to build and simultaneously trying to explain to someone what you're doing, the end result or the end state oftentimes becomes some new asset in HubSpot. And I feel like there's an unspoken value to putting thoughts on paper, which translate along the way. And it also gives you that historical record of all the work that went into something, as opposed to, let's say you build a dashboard and it takes a week to build out. It's really cool when that dashboard now exists, but sometimes I think people forget about maybe all the workflows that had to happen to get the reports to do what we want them to do so that now we have a dashboard that works. So the process mapping, I feel like, ties everything together and puts a nice bow on the historical record for what's been done. But what's your recommendation for somebody, whether they don't feel comfortable with process mapping, maybe they're newer to it? How do you ensure that?
Yeah, I think one, I would familiarize myself with some type of process mapping tool, just play around with it to get an idea of how it works, how things are visualized in a process map, and how you can connect the dots. So obviously there are tools like Miro, Lucidchart. I think first familiarizing yourself with the tools to build some type of process map. And then I typically recommend sticking with building out your current state. You have to identify how things are currently in order to, in the future, fix any problems that you're running into with processes. I think sometimes when I'm building out a current state, I think about the future state as I'm building out the current state, which is sometimes not the best thing to do. And so what I typically recommend is just start with your current state. Don't do anything else. Build that out first. Once you've got that built out and you've gotten client sign off, meaning they have looked at the current state and they have said, yes, this is how things are currently, then you can take that and you can build on it. And then you can build your future state. I think it can be easier if you just focus on the main thing.
Do you ever find that you have to explain to somebody, a stakeholder, the value of process mapping? Or do most of the time do people get it?
Yeah. I think most of the time people get it. They understand. If we don't have a foundation for understanding how all of your tech stack works together, your different processes, how marketing works with sales, how sales then works with customer success. If there's not a map, if there's not any type of historical context, it becomes hard to build out things in the future because you don't have any resources to fall back on. And I think visualizing it makes it easy for 9 out of 10 people to take that and build what they need to. Whereas if they don't have it, they're dealing with multiple clients at a time, which is often the case, and you lose track of things. So if you're losing track of things, you're losing track of processes and how things happen within each company that you're working with. And so it can become hard to manage all of that without some type of process map in place.
How often when you're meeting with these folks do you think this is the first time they've actually done an exercise that?
I think it depends on the company, honestly. I think it depends on size, how long they've been in business. For us at Workflow, I experienced more clients that hadn't been through exercises like that than I have with Aptitude 8. I think it just depends on the company size, whether they're a startup or they've been in business for a long time.
Do you have a tool of choice?
I like Lucidchart. I think Lucidchart has really been the only process mapping tool that I've used. I've tried Miro. We use ClickUp as well. Lucidchart has been my go-to for process mapping.
Yeah, I'm definitely a Miro kind of person as well.
And so I know that we've been talking about mapping. What are some of the challenges that you face in terms of delivery that you've seen for ensuring that you go through mapping, you discuss an end state, you get to the end, and something is off? What are some of the best practices or the ways that you mitigate things going wrong? Any advice or best practices out there for getting it as right on the first go around as you can?
Yeah, I think it's important to ask yourself questions. I think sometimes when I'm building out a current state or I'm building out a future state, I like to ask myself the what if questions in certain sections of the process map. If there's maybe context that I don't have, questions that I have for the client, I will jot those down. Or even they're just internal notes that I want to come back to and try to get the answer to. I think doing that more regularly will help you to think of things that could potentially break in the future before they happen. And so I think just as you're building out those current and future states, just keeping that in mind, like questions that you need to ask the client, how this relates to maybe an integration or some type of other tool that's integrated, stuff like that. For me, it opens up the potential to be on the preventative instead of the reactive, right? When things break, having to go back in and fix it. Whereas when I try to do it, I try to think of, okay, what could break and how could I make sure that it doesn't break by making sure all bases are covered.
I really like the notion of just asking yourself those extra questions, going as many layers deep into what could break, what am I missing, asking peers, hey, I'm planning on building this, who's experienced challenges in something similar that you may have done. And it's really our job to think as far ahead as we can, knowing that oftentimes something might go awry, whether it's a workflow that was built incorrectly or if there's something that was maybe missed in the scoping process. And that's why it's so important, though, to have that process mapping along the way, because it's really a cover your butt tool as well. Because if you sit there and you do the mapping together, now you have documentation on this is what we discussed, this is what should happen, as opposed to you work with an executive that just says, this is what I want, and you build it. And now maybe there's arguments about what they really wanted and what they meant versus what was delivered.
Exactly.
I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. One of my favorite questions that has been circulating in the community lately is revenue operations really seems to oftentimes be the bad guys. We're the ones who are gating sales and slowing things down. At least that can be the perception. What are your thoughts and feelings about that? Do you even hear that yourself?
Yeah, I think there's kind of some connotations that could be the case. Again, it's based on the client, right? It's not going to happen all the time, but I think there is sometimes a connotation with RevOps professionals with sales, whereas they're the bad guys, right? I think sometimes that's the case because they're the ones implementing change into the organization, and people don't like change, right? They like how they've done things for centuries. Change is necessary when you're growing, when you're scaling a company. Change is necessary in your personal life, in personal growth. And I think sometimes we're looked at as the bad guy because we're the ones implementing change. Also, because the role and the duties of the RevOps professional is not always communicated to the sales and marketing teams. If a company can come in and introduce a RevOps professional and accurately communicate to their team what is expected of this person, what their job is, what the goal of bringing them on is, they have a better appreciation for that person, but also they can get on board a little bit better, help come in and improve these processes. The goal is to improve processes, drive revenue, and help me to be a better sales rep, right? So I think that it starts from the top, right? It starts from the top down. So I think if a company can communicate that to their sales team, basically paint the picture that the RevOps professional is an ally to the sales rep, then I think it becomes less of this is a bad guy, this is somebody that I don't like, is going to be moving forward.
Do you think that, take a step back, I had a really fascinating conversation this week with a RevOps person, and her approach to doing these kind of projects is often when implementing a CRM or updating a new tool or whatever. As an ops person, you're analyzing the integrations and the fields and how they interact with each other, but there's rarely a lot of thought, at least from my perspective, or that I've seen, into how to interact with the end user of that, which oftentimes is the sale. And her process is very much about a lot of kind of psychoanalyze and psychology of the end user, interact with them to make it known and increase adoption. And I think that's severely lacking because things like adoption as a metric are obviously really important. But when somebody feels like this is a top-down decision, do you think that human piece is overlooked too often?
I think sometimes it is. I definitely think that it's probably more often than not overlooked, but I think that can be avoided. When you're working with companies to improve processes and you're training people, I think there's kind of two levels of training that you can do to prevent something like this from happening. So obviously, a lot of decisions are made from the top down, but that doesn't mean that you can't actively try to reach out to those lower level people like your sales reps and your marketing people who are not necessarily leadership, but are going to be using the tool and that need to know how to use the tool. Sometimes we'll do training where we're working specifically with departments and we'll ask like, how does this impact? We'll ask questions like, how is this going to impact you? If we're implementing this, what would you like to see? What would make your lives easier as a sales rep? What are some of the things that you're struggling with? We'll try to get some of that feedback so we can then incorporate that into the solution. Sometimes sellers don't have the right, maybe custom fields, maybe the layout, maybe things are just messy internally and they're trying to find things and they spend half the time trying to do data entry and finding historical context about the contact or company that they're trying to reach out to, and they just can't find it within the system. We can change that easily if we have that feedback from the seller. Yes, I think that sometimes the decisions from leadership are prioritized, but to really hit on the sales enablement piece, that's why I like sales enablement so much, because when I was a seller, I didn't feel like I had the resources that I needed to be successful. And I know that when you're coming in to a RevOps engagement with some company, like there's going to be sellers impacted by the things that you do. So they should be thought of when you're building out these solutions as well. You should be solving for the people that are using the CRM and not just necessarily the top level decision of we want this done. You got to think of the business as a whole and the people that are using it.
I think there's a few main hallmarks that indicate someone's a really strong and powerful revenue operations professional. One is being able to bridge the gap between the executives and the rest of the organization. So the executive team has their high level goals and they have their metrics they want to make. And the other thing that I think makes for a really strong revenue operations professional is being able to work with the end user in mind. So taking those goals and not just thinking about how do we gate sales stages better, but if we add a gate to sales stages, how does that impact sales? And how can we minimize the impact? Oftentimes, I think our role is to help companies protect them from themselves and doing everything we can to really enable everyone to succeed in their roles without handicapping them at the same time. With that in mind, one of the questions that I know you have a hot take on is related to adoption. Because obviously, if we build something and it never gets used, and when it comes to adoption, I think there are many different definitions that are out there related to how do you know if something's even really been adopted? Ryan, what's your take on knowing when you've achieved adoption?
Yeah, I think adoption is obviously all about getting the users to use the software, right? Getting them to be in it, doing what they should be doing. I think when it comes to adoption, there needs to be this reliance on the CRM to some extent. True adoption happens when you have the people that are using the software, like they almost have this reliance of I can't do my job well without the CRM, right? If you have all these different siloed tools that your team is using, that doesn't necessarily fix their problems. I think that there needs to be some type of reliance on the CRM if you're seeking true adoption. They need to be in the platform, but they also need to want to use the platform. They need to be able to confidently say that without HubSpot, without Salesforce, whatever CRM they're using, if I'm not in the CRM, I'm not effectively doing my job as well as I could be. I think that's when you get true adoption.
When you talk about, if anyone has ever worked in a product like growth motion, when you're talking about end customers, Before adoption, there is a stage of activation, which is that aha moment where the end user sees the value. And if you skip that, getting real adoption is much more difficult because they may know theoretically that there's value, but it's really about that experience. Is it the same when you're talking about internal users building for a sales team or whatever? And how do you get them to that aha moment?
Yeah, I think that, like you said, there's activation and there's adoption. I think for activation, being able to show them the value early on and consistently is very impactful in achieving adoption. So one thing I like to try to do is paint the picture early on and how it relates to their job. So if I'm working with sellers, show them the process that we've outlined and how we're going to come in and make their job easier. If it's reporting, if it's saying, hey, we can build you these email sequences, these cadences that you can use to reach your prospects better. Hey, we have this prospecting workspace that we're going to teach you how to use, and it's going to make your job way more efficient. So we're leading up to the adoption piece by setting the stage for what's possible, what the potential is, and how they can do what they're doing now even better.
I have a question. How do you handle getting ahead of somebody that thinks adopting a process is a finite step? And I say this where we can use an example of the adoption of customer lifecycle stages, one of the most fundamental elements to every business. And oftentimes, I work with teams who think, okay, we're going to sit down, we're going to set up life cycle stages, and then we're going to report on it. And that's adopted, which is true. But I think that adoption also has the implication that there's an iteration component. Just because I set up life cycle stages doesn't mean I'm never going to make an update to it. How do you get ahead of that tail end of the adoption process and help teams and executives and stakeholders understand everything we do to a degree can be an ongoing task?
Yeah, I think for something like that, when talking with the stakeholders, whatever workshop that we've got set up to build that process out, I tend to think of how can we make this scalable, right? How can we leave this open to potential change in the future, right? We want to make sure that it accurately describes our life cycle stages now, but if we need to come back and change it, it's going back to what I was talking about with the process maps, thinking future as we're building things out, right? Leaving things on the table to potentially come back to in the future to improve even better. Yeah, I think that you just have to be mindful of how things are now, how things could be in the future.
And I would add, we're not going to get it right every single time with articulating exactly what to expect every step of the way. And oftentimes you start on something and then over a 3, 6, 9 month period, you start working on other things and things can slip through the cracks. Our job is to mitigate that. But I think that what it really comes back to is just communication, which has been a recurring theme in a lot of what you've talked about today. Just being clear with communicating what to expect, updating stakeholders along the way as things are happening. That goes into the process mapping, right? Because if you map the desired end state, the process for getting there. And then you at some point we might need to revisit this in 3 to 6 months. Maybe you document that in Lucidchart or on Miro or in ClickUp. Right now, you're communicating and setting a precedent for this is what you should be expecting. Do we get it right every single time? Absolutely not. As much as you can do to proactively communicate, we might need to revisit this in 3 months and 6 months, or I'm building this today. We're not going to have enough data to really make use of it for X many of weeks or months, things like
Exactly.
that to set expectations.
Is there any stage above adoption, like super adoption or something, that's beyond them just going into the CRM and using it, like going above and beyond it, clearly having like clicking and then the end user finding additional functionality that you didn't even like present to them? Or going and reading the knowledge base to figure out their product challenges themselves? And is that like a desirable state?
Yeah, I think you could coin that as super adoption or maybe like evangelist of the CRM. I think adoption is them using the software, living in it, and they're able to do their job better because of it. And I think there's a difference between that and going out and telling everybody, this is awesome. I can do so many different things in the software that I never thought were possible. That level above adoption is quite possible. Again, they have to live in the software. They have to live in the CRM, right? To find those things. If there's different tools that they're using outside of HubSpot or outside of whatever CRM they're using, they might not come to that epiphany of, oh, there's so much more here that can help me to do my job better than if I hadn't been using the software. So I think that's definitely possible. For a RevOps professional, for a HubSpot admin like myself, that's the dream, to have somebody feel that way about the software.
Yeah, the reason I brought it up is because I was having a conversation with the same person this week. She described that she worked on a project to implement Gong, a company, and the way she realized that adoption was not only accomplished, but above and beyond is that without her even telling them, all the SDRs had downloaded their calls onto their phones and were listening to them like a podcast through Gong. And that's how she knew that adoption had happened and that this was like a highly useful product to the internal team. And so, yeah, I would imagine there's a something similar on something like HubSpot as being adopted, whether going above and beyond in some way.
I hope someone listening beats me to it and makes the graphic for what I'm about to explain, but I feel like we need a flywheel for this because traditionally I've thought about processes as steps and stages. And I think there's been this piece where we talk about the beginning of the next stage, but that would be iteration. And
Mm-hmm.
that's where now you start the whole process all over. And so, if we use life cycle stages as the example, you get through build, measure, deliver, right? Adoption, it's being used, you report on it. But then iteration starts it all over because, okay, now we realize we need to make some changes. And then now we need to look at those changes and report on them and see how they're affecting things. So if someone wants to make a flywheel graphic with adoption, iteration, and then the process step starts over, you are welcome to do so.
I'm sure there's some AI tool that can do that.
After the meet,
Chat GPT over here.
yeah, my phone, it'll have done it already.
We've talked about adoption of the CRM. Do you find that there's any objectives that consistently across stakeholders you've worked with or companies that you've seen and heard of, anything that you find tends to be a bit of a landmine where there's common pitfalls in the adoption process? And an example that comes to mind for me would be sales stages, where virtually every company I've ever worked with has had problems in true adoption of data collection during the sales process. And a way that we can help to mitigate that, a very simple one, could be turning on the rule to make sure that stages aren't skipped. Therefore, you're always getting all of your data. Are there any things that you've seen like that that just consistently across companies tend to be an area that probably some of our listeners could benefit from?
Yeah, I think things like that, like standardizing how the sellers work through the sales process. I think the sales stages is a great example. I think that I've worked with a lot of companies that don't have clearly defined sales stages, or their sellers don't entry and exit criteria for some of those sales stages. And so that's when things get tricky, right? And then also creating stages that you can use accurately for reporting and tracking the customer journey. I had a client who had a bunch of different sales stages and they were working forward and backwards in different points of the pipeline. I would recommend you not move a deal to the next stage until it's ready to be moved, because you don't want to move. A lot of the times, depending on the company, there are a lot of additional custom fields created that don't need to be. And so coming up with some type of process to maintain the integrity of your data points and not having somebody potentially go in and create a custom field, maybe tracking something is already being tracked with a different custom field. You have all these different custom fields that people have added over time. It just prevents good reporting. It prevents sales reps from entering data into the right field so that you can see your reporting correctly and accurately. I think that's a big thing too. I think that is probably the stuff that I've seen the most. Like the customer success side of things, like going from sales to customer success. Does that need to be in a deal pipeline? Does that need to be in a ticket pipeline? Like how to handle that? That's another one. I typically recommend going the like ticket route or like having stages after the close one, close loss stage instead of having its own pipeline in the deal pipeline. But yeah, those are some of the things that I've ran through the most.
But do we ever really need the ticket pipeline? Let's be real.
Debatable.
We've talked so much about revenue operations, about some of the elements of being a HubSpot admin, but I know there's overlap and there's differences between both of those roles. And I'm really keen to hear your thoughts on what are those differences and where is the overlap between being a HubSpot super admin and then being a revenue operations professional.
Yeah, I think the overlap is they're both working with RevOps, but I think if you look at like a HubSpot admin, they have deep understanding of HubSpot, right? They're technical in HubSpot. They might not necessarily have the RevOps as a whole, like how RevOps touches every aspect of the business. Whereas like a RevOps professional can be agnostic of HubSpot. They might know a ton of other CRMs, but they also might just be better about understanding how business works, how RevOps should work in context of the business problem, and understanding how marketing, sales, and customer success works together. So I think high level, like a really good RevOps professional has a mile wide understanding, and a HubSpot admin might have more of a mile deep understanding of the platform that they're working in. But I think they both go hand in hand because a HubSpot admin, you're going to be working with a RevOps professional. If you're not a RevOps professional as well, I think that RevOps professionals just have a bigger understanding of the bigger picture, whereas a HubSpot admin might just be very technical in how HubSpot works, but not really know how Sales Hub relates to the sales processes, and Marketing Hub, all the workflows relate to their marketing strategy as a whole, and the same with the customer success. So being able to really understand the business problems that they're dealing with, bridging the gap between marketing, sales, and service is what really, I think, really defines like a good RevOps professional. Whereas again, like HubSpot admin, you could be really good at HubSpot, but not know Salesforce. And a lot of companies these days have different tools integrated with their CRM, regardless of whether they're on HubSpot or not. And so I think RevOps is that mile wide understanding of everything as a whole, and HubSpot admin or Salesforce admin or whatever CRM you're in can be specific to that platform, but not see things as the bigger picture.
Another way to say it, folks, revenue operations, if you are a HubSpot admin, revenue operations is job security. Makes you more valuable. They really are not the same thing because HubSpot admin in and of itself is a much more technical role, being able to come in and build and do, whereas revenue operations certainly is much more strategic, being able to plan and think about growth and scale. The HubSpot admin ecosystem really has grown and evolved, not really grown into the revenue operations role, is because I think for one, it's not really defined across the board. Is being proficient in revenue operations for a company the same as it would be for agency A as it would be for agency B? And I think you also have the rapid growth of HubSpot, where now people are starting to have to almost pick and choose between, am I going to spend all my time continuing to learn HubSpot and figure out all of these updates that are happening, or am I going to be strategic? And the people who can do both are, I think, going to be the winners coming out on top. But
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would say if you find yourself in that position where you're HubSpot admin, you're curious as to how do I find this way towards a more broad revenue operations career, you need a healthy dose of curiosity. You may not be asked questions about how things work in the bigger picture, but maybe look at it from that perspective and think about it from that lens and just start being curious about how the sales and customer success work together. What are the points of friction? How could somebody help reduce that friction operationally? And you'll find that if the situation ever comes up where you're asked to pick up the slack somewhere, you'd be able to step into that role.
I'm really keen to hear, Ryan, what your journey was like really getting into revenue operations. How did you really find your footing being strategic and being able to walk the RevOps walk?
Yeah, like we talked about in the beginning, I have this broad marketing and sales background. I got my degree in marketing, so I understand that aspect of things. But after college, I went into more of like a sales role. So I worked a little bit in insurance, real estate, and then enterprise sales for a subsidiary of Vistaprint. I learned the ropes of both sides and how they work together. I built out a lot of different email automation and email campaigns in my seller days. We did a lot of e-commerce related stuff. And so building that out made me think, how does marketing and sales work together? We were on Salesforce at the time. It was not set up, there was not a lot of sales enablement. So for me, it was a lot of siloed systems, feeling like I was forced to fill out Salesforce with all the leads and the data that my leadership needed. I was the top seller on my team for a while, and I can only imagine how much better I would have been at my job if I had a RevOps professional set up some type of process for me to really excel in my job. And so that's why I get hyped about sales enablement and RevOps and just improving processes for companies. I think that's why I have this thought process of like bigger picture. How does everything relate to each other and how can we improve every aspect of the business and the work that I'm doing? Because I was working in siloed systems a lot and I felt the frustration of not knowing my way around, not being effective and efficient in what I was doing so that I could spend more time selling and being more successful in my role. I think when I came over to workflow, Chris was the same way. I've known Chris for a long time. He's one of my greatest friends. He has that same mentality. I was able to learn from him, but I was also able to learn by doing and just working with clients and thinking like bigger picture, right? Thinking overall strategy, like you said, and not just how does HubSpot work? How can we implement HubSpot? But what are your business requirements? What is the problem that we're trying to solve? How does marketing work? How does sales work? How does customer success work? Figuring out their processes and their workflows in separate meetings and having a separate discovery call on that and really getting a grasp of how everything works collectively so that we can improve things as a whole. I think figuring out that mentality has really helped me in my role so far.
I think for sales professionals who are out there listening to this, big takeaway should be that you want to cozy up to your RevOps guy or gal because we know how the things work and we're oftentimes the ones making it happen. So if you're looking to buddy up with anyone, that's who you want to buddy up to. I had a fairly similar journey where I was in sales, I was a rep, and I was on the floor. I was always curious about how do I get the leads that I'm getting? Why is our process the way that it is? I think I did this better, but how did we even set this up in the first place? I learned pretty quickly that the guys who knew all those answers were the revenue operations professionals because they were the ones who set it all up. They're the ones who maintain everything. Now, that's not to say that we want to encourage that at every organization, but I think that it's just a way to show that if you're a sales professional and you are thinking strategically, then sales operations, sales management, sales leadership, maybe that is a path for you. I want to touch on that notion really quickly because I know revenue operations is a topic that we talk about quite a bit here on the show. And what I want to wrap with is any thoughts that you might have on the difference between revenue operations versus sales operations, marketing operations, service ops.
Yeah, I think it's just what it sounds like. You've got individual buckets for sales ops, marketing ops, and service ops. RevOps covers everything, right? It's marketing to sales to customer success and how everything works together. The end goal for a RevOps professional is to simplify processes, make everybody's lives easier, and increase revenue, right? Create efficiencies that improves revenue and makes the business and the customer happy, right? I think oftentimes marketing ops is in their own little silo with the marketing team, sales ops is in their own little silo with the sales team, and the same for service. And so I think really implementing RevOps is going to just cataclysmically affect every aspect of the business in the best way. And I think that's the future, making sure everything is cohesive and we're one unit instead of in different silos working independently. I think when you do it that way, things fall apart more, things break more often, and people are not on the same team. They're not aligned with the messaging, the goal of the business. I think that's where RevOps really comes in and makes things better.
Yeah, I would even venture to say that having the silos of marketing operations, sales operations, service operations, those are born from a time where technology was less prevalent, and being able to, as a professional, go in and go through a course like Trailhead or HubSpot Academy and apply the mastery of revenue operations as a whole to the CRM as a whole. I think that those are maybe more outdated rules, or you are just a very large organization where you need those silos, but then you likely also have a revenue operations professional working in tandem as well. But I think for most organizations, they should be considering a revenue operations professional to oversee things and bridge the gap between teams.
Yeah, I think that just to go back to Mark's point, his comment earlier about just having a constant need for curiosity. I think for me, that's been the biggest factor in my trajectory and my growth is constantly just wanting to be learning, like learning something new. Because knowledge is growth. That's one of Aptitude 8's primary principles. We preach internally, knowledge is growth. If you're not learning, you're not growing. Constantly seeking new things to do, new projects to take on, new methodologies that you can learn about, like if it's RevOps or if it's something else, constantly be in a state of learning and seeking something new to improve yourself. If you're looking to get into RevOps, look for an agency like RevPartners or Aptitude 8 that you might be able to come on board with, or even internally, if there's any RevOps roles that you can join or apply for a company internally, that would be a great starting point. Constantly be learning.
Knowledge is growth. I love that. And being curious is so important because you can never be satisfied with anything for the role. You can't be satisfied with what does the data say? What workflows do we have? What processes do we have? You always have to be inquisitive and learn more for how do we better ourselves, the organization, etc. To everyone who's been listening, thank you very much for tuning in.
Also, for a hot second, I thought it was going to be the other Ryan on the podcast.
We'll get both of them on for next time. But Ryan, thank you so much for joining us today. If you aren't a member of the Sproggeteer group, make sure you check us out. Links are in the show notes. We also have the weekly HubSpot admin user group hosted by our friends Deanna Gloff and Kyle Jepson. That's Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Central Time. Again, link in the show notes. And then if you are checking this out on LinkedIn, you can also find replays and repeats of previous episodes on YouTube and Spotify. Thank you for tuning in, everyone, and Sprocket on.
Bye, everybody.